Um, so I'm preparing myself to just do a lot of talking. I hope people will put comments in the chat box and questions in the chat box if they have them as I go through. Certainly I would love a break from hearing myself talk. And hopefully folks will let me know when those come in because I don't think I see them readily in my current view. But I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about the AIAN FACES data and documentation. And again, pretty much everything I'm about to say would apply for 2015 and 2019. Okay, so again, like I said, I have a lot to get through. So just to break it down a little bit, I'm going to talk about the data file structure and our conventions, some additional data user resources, which I know I covered a few this morning, tips for working with the data. I could go on even longer than this session about that, but I'll focus on weights and variance estimation. Then Bianca is going to orient us to the Child and Family Data Archive website, and then toss back to me, and I'll talk a little bit about what we were sort of closing with in the last session, the process for data access. And I certainly hope that people who have gone through that process or been part of it on both sides will jump in there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about data file structure and conventions. So we create one child level data file that includes data from the fall child assessments, the fall and spring teacher-child reports, fall and spring parent surveys, and the spring teacher, center director, and program director surveys. The data on that single child level file, properly weighted, can represent Region 11 as a whole. That file contains a set of unique identifiers or ID variables. So they would, for example, identify each sampled child, each classroom in the study, each teacher, et cetera, et cetera. The file also contains demographic variables such as the child's sex, age, and race ethnicity. We also include some composite variables and some data flags indicating whether there are completed instruments for the child, and also a number of weights that we'll talk about later. In addition to all those things, the file also has item level data for the study instruments. So for example, individual responses from the parent survey. As you can see on the slide, there are some exceptions. For those, we will typically provide composite variables that I will discuss more in a moment. So as I've mentioned a few times this morning, in spring 2020, we collected direct child assessment and classroom observation data in only 7 of the 22 AIAN FACES 2019 programs in spring 2020. So those data don't represent Region 11 as a whole, but we are going to be making those data available to support users who are interested in conducting exploratory analyses of that partial data from the spring child assessments and classroom observations. And there's also a related data users manual for that partial sample data file. Again, that's a single child level file that includes data from 2 instruments, so the assessments and the classroom observations. Again, there's a unique identifier for the child, for the classroom, et cetera, on that file. Most of the variables on this file are composites because the child assessment is pretty much almost entirely, if not entirely, comprised of copyrighted measures where we can't share the item level data, or observation measures where the same would apply. We do have item level data for the native culture and language in the classroom observation, which is an observation that the work group developed for 2015 and then made some updates to for 2019. So item level data will be available for that.
I have a question about that. Maybe you're going to get into this, but so how that data file with the spring child assessments and observation data, they're only from a very small sample of programs, right? As we talked about before, the data are still being released as a part of the data set.
Yep.
Okay. So.
Yeah, I think, and again, this is like some of the processes that we're kind of putting finishing touches on. But, you know, I think you would just write that into your plan as an applicant that you would be using that data file, and then the data committee will flag for the Child and Family Data Archive, that's the data, you should be receiving both data files essentially. And part of the reason we kept it separate was to make really clear you can't do the same things with that data. But you could obviously link to get some of the variables that I assume a lot of people will want that are on the other file. So you just use a child ID.
Thanks.
Any other questions off the bat?
I'm sorry, can you remind us how many programs observation data were collected for?
7 programs.
Okay.
And I want to say it's about 30 classrooms.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay, so like I mentioned, certain data that we collected aren't included on the data file because of our agreements with the measure developers or publishers. So listed on this slide are the types of data that have been redacted from the data file that will be available at the Child and Family Data Archive. Copyright protected items have been redacted in the teacher-child report form, and these redactions are shown in the instrument and Appendix D of the user's manual. So sort of related, Appendix D doesn't include the items administered to children in the direct child assessments, nor does it include the classroom observation protocol forms. It does include that native culture and language in the classroom observation form. That's a subset of the observation that's not copyrighted. So that form is in the appendix to the user's manual. So even though you don't have, sorry.
I'm sorry. So is it okay if I ask a question here?
Go for it.
So for the class data, the first time I read that, and I read individual observation item scores, I assumed that to mean that the dimension level scores were not present, that only the domain level scores were going to be available, but really the dimension level scores are present.
Yeah, what we don't include is, I don't think we include the cycle by cycle scores. So we take the averages across the cycles to get to those dimension scores, but the dimension scores and then the domain scores are on the file. I
just want to make sure other people want to understand that, because I know for me, I was a little confused by that when I first heard that before I got the data.
So even if we don't put sort of the item level information from some of these measures on the file, chapters 3 and 4 of the user's manual and the partial sample file user's manual include descriptions of the measures in the child assessments and the classroom observations and their administration. They're also pretty well-known assessments and observation tools, and so general information on them is fairly widely available. And we've also done some work looking at how some of the assessments and observations perform in AIAN FACES, since most of them haven't been used on large samples of Native children. And so they're, spoiler, they do relatively well. They seem to be valid for the way that we're using them. And there are some reports up on the OPRE website about that. I think there's one from 2015 available already, and there'll be one from 2019 coming soon that is just looking at the performance of measures where we're using like an updated version. So for example, we went from the PPPT4 to the PPPT5 between 2015 and 2019. Let's see. Sometimes it's cutting off my notes, so I want to make sure that I tell you everything I'm supposed to tell you here. So some of the item level variables beyond those mentioned here are not included on the file. So for example, some variables were coarsened to protect confidentiality. So one example of that would be teacher race categories with very low incidence were collapsed into other. Additionally, some item level information like income is included as a composite variable rather than several item level variables. And that composite pulls from multiple sources so that we can just give it to you as a single variable, as opposed to this person answered in, hourly wages and this person answered in dollars per year. We pull that all together for you. Okay. So the composite variables and scores fall into 5 groups, with the first 4 listed here and the 5th we'll get to next.
Sarah?
Yes.
Sarah, there's a quick question in the chat. Is that for everyone or just teachers?
regarding, sorry, thank you, Michelle. Regarding the composite variables for income.
Go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
I could hear that it was regarding the income variables, but I couldn't hear after that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
I had mentioned that you had mentioned that there's a composite variable for income for teachers, but I'm wondering, is that just for teachers or for everyone included in the sample?
Oh, sorry. So there is the teacher example was that we sometimes would, that's an example of a variable. We might coarsen teacher race ethnicity. If we have something that's super low incidence, we might group it into broadly other. And then we ask parent income across several variables. And so for parent income, we have a composite and we actually impute, that's the one variable where I think it's the only variable where we impute missing data. Since that's often the kind of variable where you have pretty relatively higher levels of missing. We do ask for teacher salary, but I don't think that's a composite. I think we just have, I would have to go look at the survey item, but I think it's just a single item that asks their salary. So that wouldn't be a composite.
And we also have another question about, which you just talked about, the example of teacher race combined into other. Does that specifically collapse in the AIAN race category? So can you give some examples of what would be collapsed into other?
Sure. So off the top of my head, I think that we have in the past collapsed Black into other because it's pretty low incidence in our sample. So it's just like, I'd need to look at our data tables actually to remind myself where we actually end up. And again, it might differ for teachers versus parents, right? Because we only have like 90 teachers. We have several hundred parents. And so we're usually coarsening where we have very, very few cases and just kind of pulling things into like a slightly higher level. Does that answer?
It does, Sierra. So that's helpful.
Great.
And we have another question.
Okay.
And this question is, can teachers be linked to students, or is the teacher data kept in a separate standalone data set?
So they can, and I assume most, well, actually, here's an important thing. All analyses of AIAN FACES data should be done at the child level. That's how the study was designed. We don't really have the sample to support like very precise estimates at all at any other level. So because it's a child level file, you know, the children will be your rows and teachers will actually be duplicated across the children, right? Because we sample children within teachers. So usually you'll see a teacher appear 10 times in 10 rows or whatever. But yes, you should be able to link all of the levels so you know which classroom, which center, which program a child was in.
And you're able
de-identify.
Right, you're able to run nested models, but but they have to be at the child level, not at the classroom level, right? Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah, and it makes reporting kind of a, I won't even say a fun challenge, a challenge, because, you know, you're not going to present estimates of Region 11 teachers. You're going to present estimates of Region 11 children's teachers, which is like subtle, but important here.
You always hear us say that flipping around of, you know, the percentage of children in classrooms with these characteristics.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think that was all the questions here.
Okay, great. Thank you for stopping me. Okay. Just want to make sure what I got through. Okay, so I hadn't started this one. Okay, so some of the other types of variables and scores that we have on the file would be child and family characteristics. So we've talked about a couple of these already: race, ethnicity, age of the sampled child and their mother's age, whether they were enrolled in Head Start for their first or second year, mother's and father's employment, again, household income. We also look at aspects of parent processes and parenting. So things like family-child activities, book reading and storytelling, for example, healthcare access, parent depressive symptoms, food security, and household financial strain. The financial strain I should say we've also in 2019 added measures of material hardship to sort of further understand relationships between income and financial strain. Then we have some teacher and classroom characteristics from the teacher survey. So those capture key aspects of teachers, again, such as depressive symptoms and teacher beliefs, and aspects of classrooms, including class size and child-adult ratios. Again, classroom information from the observation will be on that separate partial sample file. I can't see my notes at the end of this slide. Program characteristics would include things focused on like teacher turnover within centers, match between teacher and family language use. Okay, so why use composites? Again, all of this is in chapter 7, which is an enormous chapter of the user's manual. And it will tell you all about the composite variables and assessment and TCR scores. So there are almost an infinite number of variables and scores that we can create using this data, right? We ask a lot of people a lot of things. But we try to give priority to constructs that use multiple items or sources and that are more effortful to create. So some variables would use a combination of data from survey instruments or from our proprietary survey management system. So we call it the SMS. So there we would have things like the child's age and sex. And we often would combine that information with information we get from the teacher, from the parent survey to sort of fill in gaps if there's missing information in one of those sources. And again, then special statistical methods and software are needed to develop some of the child assessment scores. So for example, item response theory or IRT analyses are needed for some of the assessment scores on the file. And then even if you have that knowledge and that software, some of the variables can't be created by a user applying for secondary use of the data because of those copyright protections of the item level data. So for the most part, variables that are really simple, like recodes, transformations of survey, like a single survey item, are not included as constructed variables. That's something that you can do at home, so to speak. And then again, the thing about the constructed variables is, if they're constructed in a different way across rounds, we would typically rename them. So you should be able to use the same constructed variable round to round. Okay. And then the last couple pieces are around assessment scores. So the file includes many different scores based on children's performance on the direct child assessments that you see listed here. Excuse me. In particular, for language literacy and mathematics measures, we include raw, standardized, and IRT-based scores or W scores. Which scores you use depend on your research question and the type of analysis you'll be doing. So raw scores such as counts or averages for the counts or averages for the items that a child completes. And they would be indicators of absolute performance. Standardized scores are nice because they allow for comparisons of an individual's performance relative to others of the same age or grade. So often when we present findings on the child assessments, those are nice because it's easy to put them in perspective. And then IRT or W scores are estimates of children's absolute performance if they had taken all the items in the measure. So many components of the child assessment, right, you get routed to certain items depending, the child gets routed to certain items depending on how many they're getting right or wrong. And so an IRT or W score would be an estimate had they taken all the items, which you'd have a 3 or 4-year-old sitting for far too long. More information on all of that is in the user's manual. And again, fall data is on the main file. The spring data is on that partial sample data file. Okay. And then indirect assessment scores. So a set of criterion or raw scores of children's cognitive skills around emergent literacy and social emotional development, including social skills, Problem behaviors and approaches to learning were derived from responses to that teacher-child report that I talked about this morning. Scores capturing children's social skills and problem behaviors are derived from several established rating scales for young children. And then composite scores are calculated as the sum of the item responses, so like for social skills and problem behaviors, and they indicate the extent to which the various statements reflect a child's behavior. Similarly, teacher reports of children's emergent literacy were added, with some scores providing account of a child's early literacy skills. And then teacher reported scores on approaches to learning were calculated as the mean of items and indicate the frequency with which the statements for that skill reflect a child's behavior. Assessor reported scores of children's cognitive social behavior, such as attention and sociability during the direct assessment, includes both raw and standard scores. Those are from the lighter 3 examiner rating scale. And again, I haven't said it, but the standard scores have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15 to indicate, again, that performance relative to same age children across the country. I'll pause there because I'm going to move to some of our file conventions, and I just want to see if there are any other questions about composites, constructed variables. Okay. All right. So AIAN FACES follows certain conventions when we're naming and labeling variables and assigning our missing variable codes. Most variable names on the file use a standard set of prefixes. So the first character represents the source instrument. So for example, the child assessment or the parent survey. The second character would represent the wave when the information was collected. So 1 is fall 2019, 2 is spring 2020. Parallel, if you're using the 2015 data, 1 is fall 2015, 2 is spring 2016. You can use this to identify the source and data collection wave for each of the variables. So for example, if you have a variable that starts with P1, that tells you it came from the fall 2019 parent survey. For survey or interview items, so there's like direct one-to-one correspondence item level variables, the rest of the variable name identifies the survey item number based on the source instrument. So for example, item P1D01 is based on item D1 in the fall parent survey, which asks how often someone in the family reads to the child. And in the case of a constructed or derived variable, it would usually be a shortened description of the construct that's represented by that variable. So for example, P1HH size is the number of people in the household, and it's derived from responses to the fall 2019 parent survey. There are a few exceptions that don't follow these conventions. So those would be our identifiers. So variables like child ID, which again, hopefully is relatively self-explanatory, or our analysis weights don't necessarily follow this convention. So for example, one weight that we use often in reporting is PRA1WT, and we use that when we analyze data from the parent survey. So that the fall parent survey, I should say. So that's the P1, the TCR, which is the R, the assessment, which is the A. So anyway, you don't need to know all that. This is all in the manual, but the weights don't sort of go along with our traditional naming convention. Okay, and then missing data. So there are 3 sources of missing data in AIAN FACES 2019. There's unit non-response, item non-response, and then legitimate skips. So unit non-response occurs when an entire instrument is missing for a case. So for example, a parent of a sampled child didn't do the fall parent survey. Unit non-response would be addressed to the application of analysis weights, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Item non-response is when there's missing data on an individual item that should have been responded to within that instrument. So respondents might refuse to answer a question, say they don't know the answer, or they might just skip, right? If it's a web survey, they might just hit next and they'll get a little pop-up that says, could you please answer that question? They might just hit next again. They skip it for whatever reason. We generally have fairly little item non-response because of the data being collected via web instruments or computer-assisted data collection techniques. So there are those sort of checks built in, right? Did you really mean to hit next, or could you please answer that question? That sort of thing. We use 3 codes to distinguish the 3 reasons for missing item data. We use refused, don't know, or not ascertained. And then there are items that are only answered based on a response to a prior question. So for example, Jessica actually presented on this information. Parents might be asked for more detailed information about languages spoken in the home if they first indicated that a language other than English was spoken in the home. If they say we only speak English, we're not going to ask them what's the primary language spoken in your home, right? And so we have a different code to flag when a variable is missing due to like a planned routing, planned skip. So you as a user would need to determine how to handle legitimate skips. So you'd want to go to the appendix of your user's manual, look at the instruments to see where those legitimate skips are, and how you handle those can affect your findings. So for example, if you're interested in the percentage of all children whose parent usually speaks to them in a native language at home, and you simply calculate the percentage of responses to this question D10, you might find that children's parents report speaking to them in a native language, or that many do, sorry. But to answer this question correctly, you really need to take into consideration first those parents who didn't get the item and who reported speaking only English in the home, and then skipped D10. So if we account for the legitimate skip and include those parents in our denominator, you'll see that it's a somewhat smaller percentage of children's parents who report a native language as their primary language. Okay. So again, more information on the instruments and the exact survey items can be found in the user's manual. And I should say, the user's manuals are available for download before you have access to the data, right? Someone can go to the Child and Family Data Archive website and download the user's manual. That would be a great resource in your data application. So you can see some of this now, for example, all these survey instruments. But I'm going to talk about a few resources. So leading here with the user's manual, which is the primary resource for information about the study design and its execution. So I've talked a lot about the data file, but we also in that manual talk about how we collected the data, how we trained our data collectors. There's just a lot of stuff in there. And it also includes information about the organization and structure of the data file and its use. In the section on data file content structure and use, we describe considerations for combining data across AIAN FACES 2019 and FACES 2019. I actually don't think we've talked about FACES 2019, but FACES looks at Head Start in those 10 geographically defined regions. So FACES is a study of Head Start in regions 1 through 10. In the last round of FACES and AIAN FACES, the data weren't collected at the same time, so it wasn't really appropriate to be looking across the 2 studies, but you can do that now because the data were collected on the same schedule. So users who are interested possibly in combining those data sets should really read that section carefully to understand the kinds of combined analyses that the studies can support and can't support. So for example, one thing we thought people might be interested in would be to combine the data sets to get a picture of AIAN children across regions 1 through 11, but there's actually a really large design effect. So it's not really actually an appropriate use of that combined data. But there's more information on combining the files in the manual. You would have to apply separately for the FACES data as well. There will be a data release webinar, I believe, around that as well if you're interested. The data files include many scores that were developed from responses to the direct child assessments and the teacher-child report. And the variables and scores derived from responses to the survey items and classroom observations. Manuals describe how each was constructed and offers guidance on which assessment scores to use, like I was saying earlier. Regardless of your experiences using data from large-scale studies such as AIAN FACES 2019, you should really begin by reading the Getting Started section of the user's manual. It provides a brief introduction to the study, and it directs the reader where to go to find more information on some of the major technical issues that researchers confront when working with these data. I have to read the manual from cover to cover, but I suspect most users won't. And so the getting started is a good place to start to see where you'll find the information that you need at the moment. The AIAN FACES Spring 2020 partial sample file user's manual is structured very similarly to the main user's manual. It's much shorter. We don't have to talk about weights in there, but that would be the primary source of information about the spring direct child assessment and the classroom observation. Okay. So the user's manual includes 6 appendices that provide additional information about AIAN FACES 2019 and the data on the data file. The first 4 of these focus on the study design and the instruments and measures. So I'll focus on 2 that will be, I think, of most interest here. Appendix C contains an instrument content matrix for each of the study instruments. And it's sort of hopefully a quicker way to identify the types of measures and constructs that are included in the study. So the information in the content matrices would provide a way to quickly identify the kinds of answers you could, kinds of questions you could answer using the data. You should really look at the actual items in the study instruments and be familiar with the different instruments as you proceed, right? So it's a good way to sort of narrow and say, okay, this topic is covered, but then you need to go to the instruments typically. And then Appendix D includes a copy of each survey, TCR, and interview instrument that was used. So that's how you'd see the items and how they were asked. Again, copyrighted instruments or scales are not included in that appendix because of our agreements with publishers. Okay, so for each variable on the file, the codebook in Appendix E lists the variable name and label, the data format and type, and includes a set of unweighted descriptive statistics. So researchers can review this codebook to guide their analysis and note when values obtained in your analysis maybe don't align with the raw data. But that, again, it's unweighted. That information isn't really intended for reporting, but it could be useful if you're looking at a variable and you want to know if there's any distribution, just so to speak of, for that variable. The codebook would be a good place to start. Appendix F includes detailed information about each of the composite variables and assessment scores. So if you're digging into the composites, you'd look probably at Chapter 7, where we describe them in text and tables, and then Appendix F gives a bit more detail about like actually the names of the variables that we use to construct a composite variable, for example. Okay. So I mentioned this earlier. I mentioned both of these things. So this performance of cognitive measures with Head Start children, emerging evidence for new measures in FACES and AIAN FACES 2019 is looking at the performance of the updated measures, child assessment measures we used in 2019 as compared to 2015. So for example, looking at whether the new version of the PPVT and the Woodcock-Johnson performed well in our sample. And then the other place to look would be the data table reports that I talked about this morning that are, you know, a 20-ish page introduction to the study design. In the spring report, we would have those tables showing how many and what percentage of each respondent responded to their survey in what month. So you can kind of get an eyeball of relative to different places early in the pandemic when people were responding. And that's also where you could go check, am I getting the same numbers on some sort of basic analyses? You could sort of go and check your work there if you want. None of these resources are out for 2019 yet, but the fall data tables are actually ready for posting, and OPERI is just wrapping up their process to get them posted. So those should be available hopefully quite soon. I'm going to pause because I've talked a lot and I'm about to move into weights and variance estimation. So I'll just pause and see if anybody has any questions.
see any in the chat yet, but I would
Okay.
definitely let you know if you want to keep going, and I will tell you if they pop in.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. So there are several features of AIAN FACES 2019 and most large-scale national studies that are important to keep in mind and to consider when using weighted or unweighted data in your analysis. So this came up actually a little bit earlier, but AIAN FACES 2019 and 2015 and the data collection we're doing this coming year, OMB approval, once we get OMB approval, they're all designed to produce national estimates for Region 11 Head Start children. So for all those data collections, analysis is supported at the child level. It's a sample survey. It's not a census of program centers, classrooms, or children. So only a small portion of each of those populations is selected and participates in the study. And importantly, it's also not a simple random sample of Region 11 Head Start programs, classrooms, or children. There's a complex design that includes multiple levels of sampling and stratification to reduce cost and also to ensure that the samples are representative of the population from which they were drawn. So programs, classrooms, and children did not have an equal probability of selection. Then, not all programs, staff, parents, and children who were sampled or asked to complete a study instrument did so. So there's that unit non-response I was talking about a few minutes ago. That varies by instrument. And then there are children who leave their Head Start program after fall data collection and before spring data collection. And if they leave their Head Start program in that period, they're not considered eligible for spring data collection. So just some things to keep in mind.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Can you go back to your previous slide, please?
Sure thing.
So when you say that when children leave, is that reflected in the data? So for example, child assessment data, there's A1 BMI or A2 BMI. Sorry, I have some familiarity with the data.
Yeah. No, I think I saw your poster that you presented, so I remember.
Oh gosh, that's so, okay, thank you.
It was interesting.
Yeah, it was okay, thank you. So is that, when children leave, is that reflected in the data? Like the,
Yeah, I actually don't remember if we have a flag for that, or if you would just, they just wouldn't have an A2 variable, right? I think we must have a flag, but I actually would need to double check that for you.
no worries.
And then my question would be from that, if there's a flag, do you, when you apply for the data, you have to apply for the specific variables that you want? So is a flag like that something you automatically get or something you actually have to put in your request?
I think the data file is the data file. So I don't I think that the Child and Family Data Archive is just going to send you this single file. I don't think they're subsectioning it. So you might want to say though, like if I confirm that there is that flag, we would use this to subset our analytic sample or something if you wanted to look longitudinally. You might want to say that in your application, like that would be great. And as a data committee review member, I might be like, oh, they know, they're really planning carefully, right? They've read the user's manual, how exciting for me. But I think that you get all the variables. Like the one exception this year is that if you want that partial sample data file, you need to sort of say that and talk about why you need it and how you're using it.
I can confirm you don't get all the variables.
Oh.
You actually have to, I was surprised by that in the application, having applied. You actually have to request the variables that you want, or at least we did. We had to request the variables that we wanted. We didn't just get the whole data file.
I apologize, and I misspoke.
Okay.
I know. So on our end, we just create one data file. That's all I know.
I mean, I'm on the data committee, and I was surprised. So I think that, and maybe that's a process we can clarify further, not in this group, but I was surprised. I didn't realize I had to request the specific variables, but I had to request the specific variables, and I was given only those variables. So.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Wow. That's really useful information for me, but also I imagine for anyone who wants to apply for the data. Jessica, I sort of gave you a TBD on your question, right? I know because I've reviewed the text recently for the user's manual, we do say in there in one or two places, X number of children left between fall and spring, but in terms of how as a user you'd actually identify it on the data set, I would need to confirm. Okay. Oh, I see. Is there another chat question?
I think that was from Michelle responding to the issue
to the point about the variables.
Data or just specific variables. Yeah.
Okay, so this is an important slide. Analysis weights adjust for different features of complex sample designs, like the one we use in AIAN FACES 2019. They also adjust for non-response and sample attrition that's inherent in any national longitudinal study. So specifically, weights adjust for the fact that not all units had an equal chance of selection into the sample. They also adjust for differences in non-response among certain groups of the population and for sample attrition. So when you use them, they can help reduce the potential for bias if there is differential non-response or differential attrition. In AIAN FACES 2019, the basic analysis weight inverse probability of selection is adjusted for non-response at each level of sampling and for for instrument non-response or unit non-response. So analysis weights adjust for unit non-response where an entire case or an entire instrument is missing, right? The entire fall parent survey is missing or what have you. We examine non-response bias analysis at the program and child levels with child level non-response bias analyses, including staff survey non-response, parent survey non-response, and combinations of parent and teacher-child report non-response. So we cut it a lot of different ways. And generally, we feel that the risk for non-response bias is sufficiently mitigated if researchers use the appropriate weight. But you should look at chapter 6 of the user's manual that includes more detail on those analyses if you're interested. I will say we were waiting with bated breath to see the results for the spring non-response bias analyses, right? But what I just said holds for those analyses as well. So I was breathed a big sigh of relief, right? Because we certainly saw somewhat lower response rates across most of our instruments than we have in non-pandemic times. So the weights do not adjust for item non-response. So if there are individual items in an instrument that have missing data, the weights don't adjust for that. You would need to select some sort of imputation method to adjust for item level missingness. Weights are used when estimating characteristics of the population, which again is the primary goal of AIAN FACES 2019. We're not interested in the characteristics of the exact 22 programs or those 720 children per se, but the characteristics rate of the population of Head Start children and their families, classrooms, and programs. So the data collected from sample cases, when used with the appropriate analysis weights, produces reliable estimates for the population of Region 11 Head Start children. The sticky key here. There we go. Okay, so there are 13 weights on the data file. There are 3 cross-sectional fall weights. There are 7 cross-sectional spring weights and 3 program year weights. So deciding which of the analysis weights to use can be a challenge. There's not always a clear answer actually, but there are a few simple rules that you can follow to make it seem a bit more manageable of a question. So first and foremost, the weight you choose should support the analysis that's required to answer your research question. So for example, what are the behaviors or characteristics of interest? So what data are you using? What sample and what are the source instruments you're looking at? And then does the analysis focus on a single point in time, or does it look at change from fall to spring? Answering those questions should help you decide which of the 13 weights is best for your purposes. You won't always find a single weight that perfectly fits your needs. So in some cases, you'll have to decide between 2 or more weights and base your decision on several factors, such as how much missing data are acceptable, how important it is to have full information, even if you have a reduced number of cases, for example. Comparing the number of cases that have a positive weight or value, I should say, for each of the weights you consider. So look at the number of weights with a positive value, and that should help you identify the impact of each weight on the size of your analytic sample, right? Examining the unweighted distributions for key variables for cases with a positive value on each of the different weights will also tell you how much missing data you'll have if you use one weight versus another. And again, chapter 6 is going to be your friend for all questions about weighting.
Can I add something here, Sarah?
Yeah.
Just the perspective of having applied for the data, is that you have to talk in kind of broad generalities about how you're going to use these weights when you're applying, because you can't actually go do those things to explore, right? How using these weighted variables are going to impact your power in answering the questions that you want to answer. And that can be a challenge, but it's really important that you still at least talk in broad generalities about how you are going to do that process or engage in that process. Does that make sense, Sarah? Did I say that properly?
Right, like you can't do all the things I just suggested you do until you have the data, but you can use the user's manual to say, like, I would want to do this looking at these 2 or 3 weights, right? Yeah.
Thanks. I just say it because we just finished meeting with the team who applied for the AIAN FACES 2015 data, and it was a very, like they were like, well, how do we do this without having that, talk about how you are going to explore how this will affect your power. So
yeah, it's a lot easier to just get something and play around with it. It takes a lot more work to go through the user's manual and put all these pieces together. Hopefully it makes things easier once you have the data, but yeah. Okay, so AIAN FACES 2019 weights can be used with most commonly used statistical software packages. Shown on this slide are the weight statements that are found in SAS, SPSS, and Stata. So be sure to look into what your chosen package can handle, particularly SPSS, before conducting your analysis. The AIAN FACES 2019 weights sum to population totals, so those sums can be very large. And some statistical packages will use this weighted sum for the number of observations when they're calculating variances and standard errors. And that can lead to incorrect and very small variances and standard errors and adversely affect then your tests of statistical significance. So if the package that you're using for your analyses uses the weighted N instead of the unweighted N or the actual sample size, you'll want to normalize your weights. We talk about that a bit in the getting started section of the user's manual. Once you do that, the weight will sum to the sample size, and the unweighted N will be used when calculating those variances and standard errors. We also know, I think Jessica referenced this earlier, that some researchers use multi-level modeling to examine associations, for example, between classroom or program characteristics and child outcomes. Given that our child weights take into account earlier stages of sampling, so at the program level, at the center level, at the classroom level, a multi-level model should require only weighting of data with a single child weight at level 1. So as I just mentioned, AIAN FACES 2019 is a sample survey. The data collected from sample participants are used to estimate population characteristics. Standard errors are a measure of variability of these estimates. They indicate how close an estimate derived from one sample is to the actual value in the population. The smaller the standard error, the more precise the estimate. Standard errors are also used when testing research hypotheses, so comparing characteristics of 2 or more groups of children, for example, the relationships between 2 or more variables. Because standard errors play such an important role in research, it's important to make sure that they're accurate and that they capture the key features of the sample design. So many of the standard procedures found in these commonly used statistical packages that I'm sure most of you are using assume that the data are from a simple random sample, where they assume that cases are independent from one another and every case has an equal probability of being selected. Classrooms and children in AIAN FACES are not independent, right? Everything is clustered. So classrooms within centers, centers within programs, et cetera, children within classrooms. And not all the sampling units had the same probability of being selected. So standard procedures wouldn't be appropriate for estimating standard errors generated from AIAN FACES. Software packages designed for simple random samples would tend to underestimate the standard errors using AIAN FACES data. So then using inaccurate standard errors when testing your hypotheses can lead to identifying statistically significant results where there are none present, a type 1 error, or vice versa, a type 2 error. Using the correct standard error helps to reduce the chances of those two types of errors. Okay, so how do we do this? Section D on variance estimation in Chapter 6 of the user's manual includes specifications and code that you'd use to calculate Taylor series standard errors in Sudan or SAS. Special procedures in other software packages can also be used to generate accurate estimates, and some of those packages are listed on the slide. Many software packages allow the use of sampling weights when you're doing regression analyses. However, when conducting regression analyses using AIAN FACES data, you want to use a software package that uses a Taylor series method when you're calculating the standard errors of the regression coefficients. Okay. So whenever possible, you should use the Taylor series method to calculate your standard errors for weighted estimates from the study. If that's not possible, you can use an approximation method. The method is relatively straightforward, and it involves adjusting the standard error generated by your standard software. That would be probably assuming a simple random sample, and you adjust by the design effect or def. Which is the ratio of the variance of a variable produced by specialized software that accounts for the complex design to the variance of the same variable using procedures that assume simple random sampling. So if the software package you're using uses the weighted n or the sum of weights rather than the unweighted n or sample size when estimating variances and standard errors, you have to normalize the weights, which I mentioned a couple slides ago, and use the new weight to compute the standard errors before you adjust for def. The normalized weight is created by multiplying the weight found on the AIAN FACES data file by the ratio of the sample size, the number of cases with a positive weight on the AIAN FACES weight, to the sum of the values for the same AIAN FACES weight. The new weight, or the normalized weight, will sum to the sample size. But use caution. Certain procedures in available software, so for example, for SAS users, proc univariate, will provide an erroneous number of cases if there are cases with a normalized weight that rounds to 0. So you can run into trouble there. Always check to confirm that the number of cases in your output is equal to the sum of your new weight. And then when estimating the variance of an estimate, you'll need to adjust the variance by def. When estimating the standard error, you'll adjust the standard error by the square root of the design effect, or def. And then the average AIAN FACES 2019 design effects overall, and then for select subgroups, are provided in that weighting chapter, Chapter 6 of the user's manual. Okay, so the information I've presented really just tips highlighting some important factors to consider. These are all discussed in more detail, and even what I had here is written down in the user's manual. You know, you can find, I haven't gone through this, the sampling design in much detail, but you can find that in Chapter 2 of the user's manual. And then just, like I said, discussion of the analysis ways, cross-study analyses, combining AIAN FACES data with FACES data, and variance estimation. That's all found in Chapter 6 in the sections that you see listed here. In a moment, I'm going to turn over to Bianca Monson at the Child and Family Data Archive to share a bit about how you get to the study page and how you access things on that end. But before I do that, I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Bianca.